This is Zach D. Roberts. I'm an investigative photojournalist and co-founder of Visu.News. This is the Visu.News Podcast, Isolated Incidents Edition. Each month, I interview an expert in the world of extremism on a topic in the news. This month, I'm speaking with Alisa Mahjoub. They are an independent researcher on the relationship between the Unification Church, cult group, and the United States' imperialism and fascism. Earlier this month, the former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, was assassinated. This was in part because of Abe's connections with the Unification Church. I'll post more info on the show notes on this, but I figured it was a good reason to have Alisa on to discuss their leaving the church and what this somewhat mysterious organization is really like. My introduction to the Unification Church was covering the gun cult in northern Pennsylvania, led by a pastor, Sun Moon. He is the son of the founder of the Unification Church, Reverend Sun Myung Moon. There is a much larger Unification Church that is thriving around the world, especially in South Korea, Japan, and the United States. Sun Moon's Rod of Iron Ministries is just a small sect. Anyway, let's jump into the interview with Alisa Mahjoub.
So I'm Alisa, an ex-Moonie. Let's see. I got into doing this research very heavily about a year and a half ago when I just sort of came across some bits of information that were stunning. I don't even know where I am spiritually on the spectrum, but I had this dream that sort of like I woke up and I was like, what the fuck? And I was like, I don't know if there is like some sort of like government connection to the Moonies or not. And it seems like a weird place to like sort of come from for that. Especially given all of the weird, like, spiritual trauma I've gone through. So I was very surprised by it, but I was like, I'm going to look into it anyhow. And lo and behold, in some of the weird corners of the internet, old documents and shit, I sort of began piecing together this very creepy and disconcerting, like, story of the Moonies being very involved with international fascist politics and basically, at the end of the day, sort of being like a tool of imperialism and fascism, and specifically like a lot of intelligence groups. And I'm not the only person who does research into this. There have been a lot of people in the past that have looked into this stuff. It just sort of gets, glossed over or forgotten a lot occasionally. And I have some friends that do the How Well Do You Know Your Moon blog, which is also an excellent resource. So I reached out to them immediately when I was, sort of figuring that out. And since then, we've sort of been research partners, and that's been very nice. But yeah, it's been a weird journey, to say the least.
So how did, were you, was it your family was within the Moonies, was in the Unification Church?
I'm a second generation Moonie. So that means my parents, they got matched and blessed by Reverend Moon, married together, had me. I was born into the church. Mm-hmm. So from day one, just, Moonie town.
Yeah. What and obviously you're an ex now. What was that like? Like what kind of made you either start questioning or start leaving? And then what has it been like? You talk to your family?
So I initially started the long process of leaving when I was about 14. I went away to school in another state. So that gave me a lot of physical distance away from the Moonies. And also it was like this liberal arts school in Virginia. And for the first time, I was sort of introduced to like, queer people or liberal people or people that were sort of like in the unknown other or like scary evil other category. And I was like, wow, these people are not actually bad or evil in any way whatsoever. They're actually a lot more understanding and kind in a lot of cases than any of the people that I know about. So while I was there, I actually ended up initially stumbling upon the How Well Do You Know Your Moon blog because I was starting to question things a little bit. And I was like, maybe what people are saying is true. Maybe this is a cult. I want to know more. Mm-hmm. So I did a little initial like research back then that didn't go very far, but it got me far enough to reading about something called the Tragedy of the Six Marys, which was where Moon basically coerced and sexually assaulted a bunch of married women into having sex with him because he is supposedly the Messiah and can sort of clean their lineage or whatever. And that was like, whoa, this is completely like against all theology. How is he allowed to do this stuff, but none of us are allowed to even like have sex outside of marriage or whatever?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I emailed the blog and we talked about it for a while. And then fell out of touch for a few years, or actually probably over 10 years. And then so when I was 17, then I was transferring to a school in Indiana. And so it was IU Bloomington, and it was huge. I was like, at that point, I had been wondering about it for a while, and I was finally like, I'm going to take the dive. I'm going to go out there. I'm going to date guys. I'm going to see what sex is about. So I did that, and then sort of like around that time, officially stopped going to like church events and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it took me a few years. But what I really credit to my leaving was like the actual like physical distance between me and the group, meeting other people, and then sort of like seeing those points of contention with the theology and the way that it was actually practiced for the leaders. That, I mean, to me, just sort of made a difference.
What was it's almost what I know of the Unification Church, it's weird because it walks. Different people have different experiences within the church, depending on their level of involvement, obviously with any organization. But it's surprising to hear that like what was it like? Did you have to fight your parents to go to a school out of state, or like what were your parents like that, like deeply involved, or?
So I have a very interesting experience when it comes to that. My dad has always been super involved with the church, but my mom has always sort of been within the movement. Let's just put it this way, she always speaks up for what she believes in, and she definitely saw and experienced a lot of abuse in the church, and like abuse of other people as well, and she always spoke up against it. So she was not very well looked upon in the church. And then on top of that, she had like a lot of health problems as I was a child, and including really bad asthma that is triggered both by mold and emotions. And of course, the church building had a bunch of mold in it, so she would rarely go. And when she did, she would have like a big asthma attack, and it was just like not ever worth it, especially because none of the people there she really liked, except for like a couple of her friends. But my dad was always very plugged into it, so I sort of came from this environment where my parents were on, they both believed in the theology, but they were sort of like on different sides with like the leadership and stuff. And my mom was definitely sort of encouraging me to get out of the Indiana environment, in which there was like some of the kids in the environment got sexually assaulted and stuff like that, and the church didn't do anything about it, and other things like that. So she saw it was clearly not a good environment here. She thought it might be better in other places, but whatever. It wasn't. Let's just put it that way. But so she was like, I did this thing. It was an early college program. I took the SATs early because my mom was like, you gotta go and get that like experience in or whatever, so that when you're in high school you can take it. But there was this like early college program that I was like offered to go to, and I got a scholarship there. And my mom was like, oh my God, you should do this. And I was like, I really want to do this. I really do. And my dad was like more sad about it, but like also knew that it was a really good opportunity for me. So he was fine with it at the end of the day. But when it came to actually leaving the movement, both of my parents were not very happy about that, especially my dad. That caused a lot of contention in our relationship for a while there.
Are you like, do you feel like you've been like outcast at all within, you go back home and kind of talk to like people who are most of the people you knew like in high school still in the church, or?
So a good amount of them are. I still have some friends that I was really close with during childhood that are in it, and I have other friends that have left. The ex-Mooney community right now is actually really strong and thriving, and we're trying to heal together, which is great. But I definitely do have friends who are still in the movement, and I also don't really know how to like broach these subjects with them. Potentially, I want to try, I really do, but I also don't want to make them feel like I'm judging them or whatever, But so if I were to try to go back, I think they would accept me back into the folds on a certain level. But then there's also, always that, like, oh, you've fallen because you've had sex outside of marriage and you have to start over as a first generation member and stuff. Not to say that I would ever think about going back, because I would rather die. But if I were to, there would be like sort of, I would have to probably go through like Mooney conditions and stuff like that in order to like atone for the sins of my life or whatever, you know.
Yeah. What is the big because I mean it's certainly like outwardly it portrays itself as a, at least this has been my experience talking to people that are in the church and talking to the sons, the moons, is that they definitely portray themselves as a, I guess, an evangelical Christianity. What was your experience like? What is the difference, say, between some of the more, like, there's a lot of like evangelical churches out there that are on the level of, you're like, this is walks right the line of evangelical normal church and a cult, like the level of, like, you know, following orders and kind of the pastor or the priest or whatever being a little bit bigger than, like, I'm Catholic, like obviously the priest is connected to God, but he is not, he's not an extension of God the way that, say, the Pope is or something like that. But whatever. But what is the like, what is there, like any like noticeable differences other than like Moon being, I mean, he was above a pope. I mean, he questioned God. He's gotten into arguments with God, right? I mean, like, he was bigger than Jesus. He was, you know, like, by his own admission, which is its own level of like something that even the most kind of like out there, born again, evangelical, right wing, whatever Christian groups usually wouldn't do.
Yeah. So let me put it this way. The Moonies have a lot of different influences. It's definitely not just, you know, there's certainly that evangelical Christian aspect to it. A lot of Moonies claim to be like non-denominational Christian or interfaith just because people come from different backgrounds. But in truth, there's like a lot of like traditional Korean religious influence, some Taoism and Confucianism, and then like a certain amount, actually, I'm pretty sure goes back to some of the fascist cults from like the 20s and 30s to 40s. Because like if you look up moral rearmament, pretty similar in ideology and methodology, as well as their theology. So I think it harkens back to a lot of that as well. So yeah, the Moonies believe that Sun Myung Moon was you know, the second coming of Jesus Christ, because in their theology they thought that Jesus failed his mission because he wasn't able to get married and have a family. And so, yeah, so basically he's like God tier. As you were saying, he argued, quote unquote, argued with God a lot. Yeah, he like very much is like a God king too.
It like, and if you go to like the church, if you go to the, I mean, yeah, my experiences with the Pennsylvania Unification Church, which I know is at least slightly different. But like, is it like I mean, I guess it would be if you know what the, you know, like what a Catholic mass is or something like that. Is it very similar to like a normal, like if I walked in there and be like, would I be like, oh, I kind of get the jive. It's a little bit different than, say, Catholic mass. But it's kind of the same thing. Like, because I've always been interested, see, because you talk to a lot of like American Christians that come into the church, and it's interesting that I don't know what you know, it's like, it's interesting. It would be interesting to know more about like what they see as they kind of transfer in.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So depending on where you are and what period of time, church services will look pretty different. And who's giving the sermon or whatever. So like Moon, when he would give speeches or sermons, he would just basically yell and scream and cry until his like nose was running and stuff. Like it was very intense. It'd be for like hours and hours of just this like emotional inundation coming from like this one person on stage and a group of like people completely silent, occasionally clapping when something, you know, very important or whatever is said. But there's been like, you know, if in more of like the state centers, sometimes I know back the last times I was going to church in like the early 2010s and late 2000s, in America, there was something going on called Love and Life Ministries, which was out of Manhattan Center. which Moon's daughter, Injin Moon, was leading. And that was a lot like a mega church service. They had like a worship band that would play songs like I Want to Know What Love Is. They would sing that a lot. And she would encourage like all of the second generation members to like do ballroom dance events after, which was really weird given that like before that, like up until that exact point, they were pretty much like, don't even touch a person of the opposite sex, that's a sin. And then they were like having this like all dance together. It was very confusing. I think that's why a lot of people ended up leaving, just because they were like, wow, sex must be nice.
It started with ballroom dance.
It started with ballroom dancing. They dug their own grave there. But yeah, so like the way the services have looked over time has been pretty different. And I know with the Love and Life Ministries ones, they would like they would live stream it out to the various church centers in different states and stuff.
And that, like, I think that people who are my age, older, might remember like the photos of the mass marriages and that sort of thing, because occasionally it'd be like nightly news sort of thing. But I mean, I don't think that they've been part of, like, I don't think that my like 21-year-old sister, if I mentioned it, like, I know for a fact that because when I talked to my family about going up to the Pennsylvania, and they had no idea, like, other than my mom did, but like they had no idea about it. And so it's interesting that they have been kind of behind the scenes, because this is the reason I had you on to talk about, wanted to get the intro though, but they've been like behind the scenes in obviously like so much in American politics for decades. And like, I don't think that we think of them, like, that's been like a new intro even to me, like just in the past, like probably 3 years, I've kind of learned about what their level of involvement on just in American and their power and their kind of swing that they've had. Could you talk a little bit? I mean, it's a very general question, but like, could you talk a little bit about that? Or
yeah, absolutely. So their political swing comes from a number of, or they have like political swing for a number of different factors. They've definitely got their large propaganda outlets like the Washington Times, which, you know, what was that, Reagan's favorite newspaper? They also have their hands in pretty much every business avenue that you can. Maybe not every, but quite a few business ventures there. Like most of the fresh seafood in the United States is owned by a Mooney company. Most of that distribution is theirs. They also own a lot of arms companies, more propaganda throughout the world as well. Let's see. And then, you know, a significant number, you know, a lot of their money also comes from the members who will just, you know, donate these. They say that they are not mandatory donations, but they pretty much are if you want your, you know, your family to not go to hell in the afterlife.
It's a tithe.
Right. Yeah. So it's like it's a mandatory tithe. I do say mandatory because like the amount of social and you know, spiritual pressure they put on you for that pretty much makes it, you know, so that you have to do it, which is and it's exorbitantly more for Japanese members too, because of the church's philosophy and ideology, basically stating that, you know, the Japanese have to pay reparations to Korea for that whole period of history. And so, I mean, that factors into what we're going to be talking about later with the Yamagami thing.
Yeah, sure.
But so yeah, they've got business, they've got propaganda. There is a significant amount of evidence to suggest that they were used at like several different points in time throughout the globe to traffic things as a back alley for the CIA. You know, like specifics there are harder to pinpoint down, but there's a significant amount of speculation around it. And I personally wonder if they are the undisclosed religious group that was involved in the Iran-Contra scandals, because I know that they were already at that time period, you know, doing a lot of like material support and propaganda support for the Contras. And there's also speculation and reason to believe that they might have actually been like training people to fight for that. So it sort of goes deep. There's like this like explicit relationship with the state that the Moonies have. And I think that's where they get most of their power, honestly, because they're able to do these business relationships with all these rich people. Plus, you know, then they are given these positions of power in things like the World Anti-Communist League or the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, where, obviously just an international league of fascists with way too much money throwing it at random shit.
Yeah.
Not random shit, like very strategic shit, I would
yeah.
say. But it seems random if you look at it sometimes, if you don't have like some sort of context.
yeah. It's let's just let's go to, because the reason that they've been kind of out of the news, other than again like news stories about the Pennsylvania gun cult church, as like the American media usually calls it, but like, so there's a tie-in to the assassination of former Prime Minister Abe. Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the shooter, Yamagami, stated that he has a lot of resentment toward the Unification Church, which Abe is pretty much like integrally like tied to, because his Yamagami's mother had donated so much money, including his college tuition fund, which so he had to drop out, and that caused a lot of familial trauma. Their family went bankrupt, etc. But Shinzo Abe's grandfather was Nobusuke Kishi, who was this Class A war criminal from World War II, who was basically let off by the CIA and instructed them to like start the Liberal Democratic Party. So that relationship is passed down in his family through the years. And there's been a lot of support like back and forth, like the church gives money to these organizations or they give money to the church, and there's that back and forth. Plus, like the church will also tell the members, go and vote for these LDP candidates. So he was involved. Anybody saying that he wasn't is, like any news story that's saying like, oh, just Yamagami thought that this guy was involved with the Moonies. No, he was. He absolutely was. Just need to clear that up for anybody who's reading something that says that. But yeah, so when it comes back to Yamagami, he's obviously, his mother joined when he was a teenager. It sounds like his late teens. And he obviously went through a huge amount of like abuse and trauma related to the situation, which I think on a lot of levels, most second generation members of Moonies can relate to. Now, most of us don't go out and try to kill people, but I mean, that's also something to be said with the amount of care and support for those who have gone through something like this, that's not adequate in any way. And, yeah.
It's because it's I guess an unfortunate way of finding out about this, but I mean, like, it was the tithing, for lack of for the kind of medieval version of tithing where it is mandatory and it's not, but like it was an incredible. I was trying to find exactly how much money it was, millions in yen. Just a little editor's note here. It actually was 100 million yen, which is about 720,000 US dollars. A story in the Japan Times says that the donations included a payout of about 60 million yens in connection with the death of their father. The uncle told reporters proceeds from the sale of the family's land and house were also donated by the mother to the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, widely known as the Unification Church. She continued donating smaller amounts even after she became bankrupt in 2002, said the 77-year-old uncle. The uncle also said, "I believe she was a very important follower of the church. She was under mind control." The man's mother joined the church around 1991 following the father's suicide in 1984. The church had claimed it returned 50 million yen to her, while adding that there were no records of the amounts of the donations she made to the organization. Now back to the regularly scheduled interview. Thank you. One thing that was really interesting early on following the Trump campaign was seeing the large numbers of the Korean and Chinese communities within like in a large in quotes, like they look large amongst the sea of 10,000 very white people, and then there'd be a 30 or 40 like Chinese like signs and everything, t-shirts and everything like that, and so it's interesting, like what what is it that's about Trump that you think that attracts the Unification Church, the Mooney religion so devotedly? I mean, like that, I would say, like the people that I spoke to, again, this is, from Pennsylvania, people that I spoke to, it is almost a different level of MAGA. And
Ultra
they definitely,
MAGA, whatever they call it. Yeah.
What's that? Yeah.
They call it ultra MAGA or whatever, sort of
Yeah.
that, like,
Yeah. It's not even, it's like a different, it's like, I don't even know if I'd say it's like a replacement, like they found their replacement for Reverend Moon. I don't know if I'd go that far, but like it's something kind of along those lines where it's just like, it is a devotion to this guy who,
it feels like, yeah, two very compatible cult leaders that are sort of like very much cooperating on certain levels. And I know there's like a significant overlap with Moonies and specifically like the Rod of Iron Sanctuary Church members in the QAnon community.
Yeah.
So there's like, already, like going into it, like I feel like sometimes cults kind of converge like that because there was already sort of this like willingness to accept whatever leadership tells you, and sort of this like very readiness to sort of like put people on a pedestal or worship them for their status or connections or supposed spiritual goodness or whatever. And that just like falls in line perfectly with the Trump stuff. So, what you're seeing is like Trump speaking at Mooney events, and, like a lot of the church members obviously support Trump. And then of course there's like the Rod of Iron Ministries people who are, like their support Mastriano, like they're, they, oh gosh, going into this whole thing. So they have, several plots of land that they own throughout the United States. They've got some land in Pennsylvania, and they've got land in Tennessee, which they are calling like their version of Chungkyung, which is the church grounds in Korea, the town that they own. Yeah. And then they've got their plot of land in Waco, Texas, where they are planning to train people for a violent confrontation with the left.
Yeah.
So they are very much like militia building. And, Rod of Iron, from the name Rod of Iron Ministries, they think that God is talking about guns. So they had this a couple of years ago.
Well-known lover of armories, Jesus Christ.
Well, I gotta tell you, the second Christ, Moon, loves armories. He owns a.
That's the question. Is Justin and Sean, are they outliers? Like when it comes to, because I like the whole like level of worship of guns. I mean, like literally the crown made of bullets and everything like that. Is there any of that in kind of the rest of the Unification Church and the rest of the Mooney religion?
So it's harder to find, but yes, I have found several times that Moon has specifically stated things like he at one point there was a speech that said something along the lines of, if you're a Unification Church member, you are a volunteer soldier to fight against the communist North, if it comes to that, basically. And plus, like, they owned a bunch of armories around the world, a bunch of arms manufacturing companies. And then like I've just read several things like that about how they wanted to like basically sort of form their own like spiritual militia, sort of. And I've come across that in a couple of places. So there's definitely
did you ever experience that in like you going to church, or like were guns like a big thing in your community?
They weren't. No. And that's just one of the things that has sort of been like covered up about the church. And I think a lot of people just don't tend to know those bits. I wouldn't say that at the time I was in the church in America, or at least where I was, there was a large gun culture by any means. But looking around the globe, I feel like it might have been differently in certain places. Especially if the church actually was like training people for the Contras and stuff, like,
Is it a end of the world sort of thing, or is it just a political, like, we're going to have to fight the leftists? Or is it, you know, I mean, like a lot of other evangelical, like the reason why they have guns, the reason why they're prepping, the reason why they're doing all this is that, you know, there's the 100 years or whatever, 1,000 years or whatever that they're going to have to wait for after the apocalypse, for lack of a better term.
So yeah, it's a bit of both. It's political, but the means to support that are spreading like these apocalyptic visions pretty much about, you know, sort of like war with the communists or Antifa or whatever. Or I think as Sean at one point called them the globalist Marxists or something like that, you know, just like all, you know, clearly all of this sort of like McCarthy language.
Is there because I mean, one thing that like listening to Pastor Sean Moon, there's definite a lot of, you know, if you listen to code words, again, globalist is at this point, if you say the word globalist, I immediately go like you're playing with anti-Semitism here.
And the church is heavily anti-Semitic.
I mean, that's my question. Like, did you see, I mean, do you remember that? Like, was that because I mean, a lot of born again, like have, you know, we the original sin of it was, you know, Jesus, who Jesus was supposedly killed by, if you got by a lot of like right-wing Christians. Like, was that a lot was that like present in the church?
So, what Moon said about it is that it was partly the Israelites' fault for the Holocaust. And he also in several places claimed to have, in the spirit world, blessed Hitler and Stalin and a bunch of other horrible people, etc. So there's like clearly this like, you know, very implicit like anti-Semitism about the church. And then like the more I learn about it, the church was like directly involved with like Nazis and stuff in the World Anti-Communist League, tracks completely. Also in, oh gosh, here's a fun fact. So the Moonies helped orchestrate the Bolivian cocaine coup, and they worked directly with the quote unquote ex-Nazi, still Nazi, you don't stop being a Nazi, Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, in the cocaine coup there. So, you know, there's just a lot to it. And the church itself claims to be, you know, very like, oh, we have lots of people from different faiths and different nationalities and different ethnicities in our church. But the way it's practiced is very hierarchical and extremely racist.
Yeah, it's interesting. What I think whether that's are there any other because I mean one thing I think that's people that when I've talked about the church, the Sean Moon's church, is the surprise that a church is basically directly funded by arms manufacturer. Is that because I mean that's one thing I've been trying to figure out is separating how separate is Moon's is Sean and Sean's part of the Unification Church from, say, the rest of the Unification Church, because it does seem to be separate, but there obviously does seem to be a blend.
Right. So there is definitely a distinction because it's basically at the point of the church has now split into several schisms. There are different sects within it, and the Rod of Iron Ministries is just a single sect. Because when Moon died, there was this whole like fiasco about, you know, who's taking control. And apparently before Moon died, he had like crowned Sean as his successor. But then Hak Jahan, his Moon's wife, took over instead. So that created a lot of contention there. And Sean Moon and several of his brothers actually have like stated that they want their mother dead, not specifically dead, not just dead, but specifically beheaded. So there's this very like large amount of interchurch drama going on. I don't know at the end of the day how separate finances are. Haven't looked into that specifically. I'm sure, I mean, I can do that for sure, but yeah, they're like, to a degree they are similar, and they all do think that Moon was, you know, the third Adam, and that he was the second coming of Jesus. But from then it sort of starts to take different turns.
Yeah. So basically, like if you're like in Indiana Unification Church and you're visiting Pennsylvania, you could go potentially you could go to the God, I'm blanking on what his church is specifically named. But you could go to the Rod of Iron Ministries and like have service, and it, because I mean, like,
I know they are trying to like actively recruit people out of the main faction into their faction.
Yeah.
So I'm sure they would be open to having people from other factions there. But you know, I don't know. At the end of the day, I just don't know how much, you know, they sort of interact, or the members interact, because I know it's like split a lot of families apart and stuff too, with the various schisms within the movement.
Yeah.
And you know, people will be like, oh, I'm in one sector, my parents are in a different sector, my brother's in a different sector, whatever, you know. So you know, there's a lot of disagreement there.
Yeah, because I mean, I just distinctly remember, like, I spoke to a gentleman who was had been in the church for quite a while, and I couldn't tell whether he had started. I don't think that his age would have matched up with started. Like, he definitely started before Sean Moon's, because he was much older than Sean is, and so like he would have been, you know, like, it just logistically it wouldn't have been a thing. And he was furious. There was one of the there was a sheriff there, Sheriff Mack, who is part of the CSP, Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. Basically, they believe that sheriffs and elected police officers basically are above the Supreme Court, because they are sworn in, unlike they're voted and sworn in. So basically they shouldn't have to do it. He was speaking there and talking about things, and he got into it with Sheriff Mack, who does not deal well with people arguing with him, as someone who's argued with him before, like multiple times. I think he also was a little, because I was in the room filming, so I'm sure he was also happy about me filming it. But I talked to him for quite a while after, unfortunately off camera, and he like lost it, like was physically like thinking about the direction the church had gone under Sean, and the fact that like its obsession with guns, its cult-like following of Trump, and kind of its hard right-wing turn. And so this is like, that was one of the ones where I was just like, I'm curious on like how much, because I mean, it's obviously in some churches it's implicit that it's right in your face, you know, which I think in the Rod of Iron Ministries, it is part Trump, guns, that whole world is part of the religion, as opposed to the implication of the implication that we're big fans of having guns, but like, I'm not going to hold up a AR-15 in front of on the pupil and, you know, scream, you know, this is what we were, you know, this is what we are fighting for. I don't know if that there's no real question there. It's just something that I've been thinking a lot about since talking to you on Twitter, about whether or not the Rod of Iron Ministries is going to be able to kind of expand more, because they do have, like you were saying, like the properties that they're picking up, very kind of, I mean, there's been a lot of really good journalism about it, but it's kind of been quiet. Like, they haven't made that big of a deal out of it, which, you know, but they're spending incredible sums of money buying huge plots of lands, and building, you know, pretty good sized structures, which is a surprise considering the Unification Church in Pennsylvania is very tiny. I was actually really surprised. I was kind of expecting a spectacle, and then I drive up and I'm like, this looked like the little tiny Catholic church I went to as a kid. That was like basically 2 double wides, and, you know, there's a little more than that. I mean, they have a little bit more of a thing going on, but I don't know. It's just interesting that that it'll be interesting to watch, like, the older crowd, if they are successful in kind of expanding outside of Pennsylvania and outside of kind of the East Coast into the rest of the country, what the rest of the Unification Church is going to see, and whether that might be like a potential like real schism, like you're saying, between like the older and the new church. But,
yeah, absolutely. I definitely interested to see how that all plays out. I can't see it leading to anything good though.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that'll be, so my final question is like, where do you think all of the, I mean, this is most general and kind of tough question, like, where does all of this go? Like, because again, like outside of a couple of news stories about the church and really, like photo essays basically from like a couple people, it hasn't, like the church isn't talked about even in the way that like a lot of the mega churches are, even though like Sean, he was at January 6th. He was at the Capitol steps. I think that I don't know. My dream is that I can find a photo of him on the bus with Doug Mastriano, but I would assume that would have already come out by now. I don't know, maybe not, but because it's actually really interesting that he hasn't shown up. Like, because I mean, Mastriano just doesn't seem to give a shit about like perception. Of outside of his like his circle.
Time for that. I'm sure he'll pop back up in that area.
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking because I mean the Rod of Iron festival is coming up in October, and it's interesting that I haven't seen any politicians' names on it on their like kind of like speakers list. It's early still, but it'll be interesting to see what how they play out in the home state, because they could pull a lot of swing in that state because it's so close with Mastriano.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. That's a worry for sure.
Yeah, especially considering Mastriano would then control the elections of the state of Pennsylvania, which is its own terrifying thing. But anyway, ending on a weird side off note, which is always the best way to end interviews, at least when I do it. Where can people find your work and support your work?
So my Twitter, oh gosh, let me see if there's an underscore in this. It's Alisa _Mahjoub, ALISA_MAHJOUB. Got a Patreon at the moment that's linked there, I believe. Don't have any subscribers yet, so that would be cool, because these books for all of this research kind of end up costing a lot of money at the end of the day. So if anybody wants to do that, by all means, you don't have to, but that'd be nice. So that's where most of my stuff is at the moment. A couple of other ex-Moonies and I now have sort of this like little educational / conversation collective that we're sort of trying to get more of this information out there. And also, maybe do some like de-radicalization resources and stuff like that as well. We're looking into a lot of different options for that, but sort of we want it to be a little multifaceted. Doesn't have a name yet, but when it does, and when we have an online presence, that will be linked in my profile probably too.
Well, I'll have you back on whenever that is, and we'll talk about it, because I am very very interested in following them, especially considering they're one of the very few groups that they were very welcoming to me. I don't know whether they'll be welcoming the second time around after I published an article that called them some things they may not like, but I don't know whether or not they even know about it. They probably do, because the Progressive magazine tagged them on the Instagram. They tagged the church. They tagged the Rod of Iron Festival on the Instagram article, and I'm like, God damn it! Wow. Which I guess it makes sense or whatever. You just kind of going through and boop, you hit those buttons, but it was just one of those things where I'm just like, okay, well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to go back again.
Right.
On the other hand, they may the photos are really nice, so I mean, they may love it. A lot of the MAGA world always actually loved my coverage of them, because they're like, no, this is exactly who we want to be seen as. But thanks again, and we'll definitely have you on again soon.
Sounds good. Appreciate it so much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening. This is Zach D. Roberts again with the Visu.News Podcast, and you can support our work at patreon.com/ZDRoberts. That's ZDROBERTS, and that supports all of our work at Visu.News, and also just kind of in general. You can find the podcast at Visu.News, VISU.News, and of course, you can subscribe on any of the platforms, even Spotify.